think it'll work. So we still have a few folks missing, but we'll get started. So there were two quiz questions I asked last class. The first one was the 10 Commandments question, which that's really more of a memory test. I talk about it a little bit at the time. So that's the kind of a lead in to talk about how our mind works and so on. So one of the reasons you take college courses in philosophy in particular, or even logic, if you take intro to logic, is hopefully get a little bit smarter somehow. I can't guarantee that it actually works, because look at me. I've been studying this stuff since 1970, I suppose. So I can't guarantee that it helps, unless, of course, you marry the smartest woman, and she takes care of you. So that worked well for me. So I highly recommend, if you're a male, marry the smartest woman that you can find and do what she says. That's really the best thing for a guy, I think, if you want to live long and prosper. The Vulcan values. What else? But so the 10 Commandments, that's pretty fun. A lot of folks sent me their own version, which is always hilarious. I don't know if you saw the link to my the ones I've collected that are hilarious. Don't believe in idol gods, the ones that don't do anything and they're lazy. That's kind of fun. But the second quiz question, of course, was Jesus comes to your door. So this is a hypothetical. I realize a lot of people might not even believe in God, might not be Christian, might not believe in Jesus, might not believe Jesus is God, even if you think he had great wisdom or whatever. But so it's kind of interesting, because it sets us up with this situation where you're basically giving up on the sensual life, on the physical world. Did I talk about that at all? I talked about Plato's conception, right? And notice that that's the kind of thing that all of the major religions, well, if you think of the three religions of the book, right? Islam, Christianity, Judaism, right? In reverse order. We're all based on a text, for the most part, and traditions as well. But it seems like the main goal of that, well, not so much maybe Judaism, but at least with Christianity and Islam, and asceticism. This is right. Asceticism is living without attachment to things. So that seems to be the main goal of that, and it seems very Greek philosophically. I remember Pope Ratzinger, Pope Benedict XVI, right? Joseph Ratzinger, one of his books, kind of critiques the idea that Christianity is kind of a merger of Greek philosophy and Hebrew scripture. But then, you do have to sort of acknowledge, at least to some extent, that that's the case. So it's kind of interesting how you interpret that stuff really merged together. What Jesus is asking us is to live a particular type of life. And so what we're essentially doing is if we follow him, is we're giving up attachment to possessions, to loved ones even. So like if you're a mom, notice that he doesn't ask moms to follow him. It's just the apostles, right? There were women in the stories, that Mary Magdalene especially, right? Did you see the Da Vinci Code? Yes, it's kind of silly, really, but cool movie. But obviously he's recruiting fellow rabbis or other really retired males I would think, elderly males that were going to go out and basically preach to the community. It's also interesting that they're very similar in some ways to Socrates. Socrates did the same kind of thing, went and basically argued with people. So there are interesting books that compare Socrates and Jesus. All sorts of essays. For forever, people have written comparison essays comparing the two of them. And their methods even. So one book, for example, argues if you're really honest to Jesus, so he argues if you're really honest to Jesus, you would discover that he's really a cynic philosopher. So what's the connection there? You've got so if we figure Socrates, and then Plato, and then Aristotle, which is a sequence you can remember by SPA, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. That's interesting. But then you also have contemporaries of Aristotle, which include people like the Cynics, and one of them, so Diogenes would be one of the main ones. In fact, Diogenes, I got a picture of Diogenes. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, which is a good one here? I guess this is a good one. So this is Renaissance painting. So it's not like any of these are supposed to really look like the correct individual. This is a painting in the Vatican Library, the Pope's Library. It's on the side representing reason of the library. It's like a long hall, and this is actually in the room. So you can see, like, this is actually the archway of the room. This is a real door in the room, right? So this is the painting in the arch there, painted by Raphael or his team, because he was like the team leader and director, I guess. But so, can you see that very well or not? Miserable. But so that's Plato in the picture, and Plato is actually Da Vinci. We have pictures of Da Vinci. Da Vinci was kind of like Raphael's mentor, and so they all know, oh, that's Da Vinci there, who's supposed to be Plato. And if you can see, he's got his hand, he's sticking it up in the air, and that's representing, well, remember, everything non-substantial, heaven's up that way, that kind of thing. Aristotle, no clue who he might actually have, the model actually might have been for him, but he's pointing this way, so sort of down, and he represents kind of the opposite philosophy, even though he was Plato's student. He represents the idea that everything that exists actually has to have substance. So the spiritual ideas that Plato's talking about can't really exist. Triangularity, it's an idea, but it doesn't really exist someplace, in the structure of the world. It's just an idea. And so the only things that really exist are physical things. So that's Aristotle. And Plato's carrying a book that's the Republic in the painting. Aristotle is carrying his Ethics, Nicomachean Ethics. Plato's dressed in sky colors, so he's dressed in like a reddish color for the sun and a bluish color for sky, and Aristotle's got a bluish color for the water and brown for the earth. It's odd because Plato isn't really much, he's actually older than Socrates. Here's Socrates over here with his group that he's, Thrasymachus is this one, but they're all arguing there. But here's Diogenes. Diogenes is the bum, just kind of lying there on the steps, reading something. No one knows what he's reading, but he's kind of like the bum sitting there. And so if you think, well, cynic means dog, so the cynics are the dog philosophers, and they basically believe that the best life is the life of the dog, in the sense, and by the way, the Greeks thought highly of the dogs, apparently. They even had by the dog, I swear, says Socrates, right? So they thought highly of dogs and the dog life, because they're happy. That's, if I could be, just live the life of a dog, that would be true happiness. It's a weird thought, right? But so the idea, of course, is that they're not out there trying to make $1. They're not trying to have the best house on the block. They're not, trying to buy the best car, or have a boat, or 2 houses, here in New Jersey or something. My dad always wanted a summer home in New Jersey. He had one, actually, ended up, and then retired there. So I make fun of people that want a house in Jersey. That's no way to try to live. You go crazy worrying about your other house. While you're living in the one, you worry about the other one. You get a brand new car, you're all thrilled, and then some kid comes out, Fred Meyer's parking lot, and gets in the big SUV that's parked right next to you, and the kid goes, douche, with the door. Kid, you can't yell at the kid, because of course the kid doesn't realize that he's just smashing his mom's SUV into your car, brand new, and you're like, oh, you got a scratch. You're all upset about a thing. Should you be worried about stuff? Cynics don't have to worry about that stuff. Diogenes famously tried to, so he just has like a little knapsack that he carries with his stuff, and he had a cup that he took with him, and the one time he was in a town, his stories, right, and he was getting a cup of water from the well, and a kid came out and used his hands to just scoop some water up, and Diogenes realized he didn't even need the cup, so he threw the cup away. Like kind of those things. All kinds of fun stories about Diogenes. But so he's one of those that we think of as a cynic, and in a way we could think of him as a follower of Socrates, because Socrates had a lot of those characteristics. So we can think of the cynics as followers of Socrates. Well, going back to, by the way, there's a self-portrait. So that's a selfie, right? That's Raphael there. There's websites where you could like hover your mouse over all of the different individuals and see who they think they were and so on. Follow me. All the different Pythagoras, all that stuff. So that's a famous painting. But Robert Funk argues that John the Baptist was a cynic philosopher, and Jesus was one of John's followers. So Robert Funk argues that Jesus' philosophy is basically the cynic philosophy. So that's cool if you're into reading books like that about the life of Jesus. Gives some interesting interpretations and so on about things. But so when you're comparing Jesus with, say, Socrates, right, you can see in this interpretation, Jesus is actually kind of a follower of Socrates. Wow, that's kind of an intriguing way of making that comparison. They also had Epicurus, and his philosophy, Epicurus, we still call Epicurean. Epicurean, right? So it's just his name. And the main thing about Epicurus that people think about that really looks weird, doesn't it? It can damage the faces. So mostly today what we think about when we think of Epicurus, we think of restaurants that sell really expensive, fancy meals with very spicy food usually. And what's odd is when you read Epicurus's thoughts, those would be absolutely the kinds of places he would hate, because he was arguing that you should eat foods that were plain and simple, safe, no shellfish, no beans, odd things. And he was into self-subsistence, so he didn't think you should be concerned about wealth and all that other stuff. He thought you should live in the garden, have your own. So it's actually like a bush philosophy, in a way. How here in Alaska, a lot of people want to live out in the bush. They have their own cabin, have their own garden, do their own hunting, that sort of thing, raise their family out there. But it's different than the cynics in the sense that you actually have stuff, you love your family, you're not a loner, kind of wandering around, maybe with some followers, but basically without a society. Whereas Epicurus, you want to live in a society, but you want that society to be as simple as possible, so that you don't have the kinds of nerve-wracking tensions associated with, this school board's meeting tonight and we're all upset because such and such, and you don't want any of those stresses. So if you think about it, these are different points of view of how to live the perfect life. For the cynic, it's do away with all of the stresses associated with urban life as much as possible. With Epicurus, it's doing away with the stresses but having a lot of the nicer things. And then kind of in a logical progression, the next one over are the Stoics. And the Stoics, lots of different examples of Stoics. Epictetus is one that a lot of folks use. Oops. So Epictetus, I don't know if you can you see that from the back? Very good. So Epictetus, he was actually a slave, but his owner was one of Nero's council members, and Epictetus was an educated slave and did a lot of the note-taking and so on. So a big part of the government, really, for Nero's government. And Epictetus's philosophy, the Stoic philosophy, really is the philosophy of the state. So, for example, the Nazi philosophy is essentially is a Stoic philosophy, right? And then the main goal for the Stoic is the state. And the idea really comes from Aristotle. So there is this connection then through Socrates and Plato to Aristotle to think that in order for you to have the good life, what you have to have is a good family who raises you properly, feeds you well, loves you, cares for you, gives you the best education possible, make sure you have high-speed internet, that kind of thing. But in order to do that, in order to have a good family, you have to live in a good town, like Eagle River, that has internet available, and has, security, good schools, good food available, all the good things. You have to have, it takes a village, right? You have to have a good community in order to have a family do well. Right? And by the way, in order to have a good community, you actually have to deal with the community needs. You have to pay your taxes, you have to participate, you have to vote, you have to engage, the community's dialogues over what's best and everything. Somebody has to do it. Somebody has to be the police. Somebody has to be the fire department. Somebody has to be the emergency care people, right? So you can't have a good community if everybody basically tries to live like Epicurus. That doesn't work. It certainly doesn't work if everybody's kind of a homeless bum with a cardboard sign, which is pretty close to a cynic, if you think about it, right? So somebody's got to run the community, right? So the Stoic philosophy puts duty to the state first. So each of these is kind of an answer to how you should live your life, right? So what's the most meaningful kind of life you can have? And these are answers to that, right? If you think of it, there's still essentially the logical answers that we have. We could add a couple more. The next one logically over, I think, is the skeptic. The skeptic basically says, you can't really answer whether there is a heaven or not, or whether you'll go to hell if you live this kind of life, or you can't really know any of that stuff. So I'm not even, and what will make you an anxious person is worrying about it. So the best thing really is to realize that we can't know these answers and not worry and argue over them. So not get into philosophical arguments over this stuff, basically, as a good thing for you to live your life, right? Avoid that. So that's essentially the skeptic position. And then besides that, we go on to the Neoplatonists, which are essentially what the Christians will be, the official dogmatic Orthodox, or we want to call them Christians, when they in 340, when they define what it means to be a good Christian, the Nicene Council. $325. I said 340. I don't know why I have. So the First Council of Nicaea, which the emperor called to stop the fighting between the Christian groups. He wanted to have a nice, peaceful empire now that he had reunified it. And so he basically called all the Christians, bishops really, to come together to the Hilton in Nicaea. And they all had a great big conference. And they decided, okay, so what's the Bible going to be? What books can be in it? What's the beliefs that we basically have to have as kind of the definition of being a good Christian? So you get the Nicene Creed, which, by the way, creed means credo. I believe in Latin. So credo and unum Deum, I believe in one God. So that's where that comes from initially. Although there were other creeds, there are hundreds of creeds actually. Eventually. So when we think what Jesus is asking us when he asks that question, he's setting us with a task of, this is the kind of life you should be leading. That's the best kind of life. But we also have to think, well, who's going to be worried about meaning of life? Right? So what are the requirements for you to even be worried about meaning of life questions? That's where we kind of transition to Susan Wolf. a chance to read Susan Wolf's piece or listen to her, the video that I clicked on, it was kind of neat because it's the same title. It was her giving a presentation to the incoming class at Princeton in 2016, I guess, for the class of 2018. And same topic. What mostly happens in that was what the critiques that she gets from the three other professors there. I especially like Eddie Glaudes. Gloud. Pretty interesting critiques. So, anybody see those? Feel anything? See how my syllabus works? That I've got the reading that's in the book if you get the chance. Usually, and then I picked a video that I thought would go with it. So if you could read the article and watch the videos, that's kind of like a homework assignment if you get the chance. But if you don't want to talk about it, that's okay. I love to talk. No problem. And I'm 66 now, so I only have about 20 years left to talk. I got a lot to fit in before. But I plan on living forever, actually. And so far, so good. So let's think about Susan Wolf's article. What did you think of her point of view? Anybody? The meaning of lives. What does she think of the question?
She didn't think that it could really be answered.
It's a non-question for her. It's a non-starter. It makes no sense, right? And worse, right? She says, nobody really worries about this anymore. That's totally false as far as I know. I mean, my philosophical career, one of the main questions everybody's been asking is, what's the meaning of life? So for her to say, all you dummies out there that still think that's a real question, it doesn't even mean anything. Well, what on earth is she talking about? Does she agree with herself, actually?
That it doesn't mean anything?
Yeah. The whole rest of her article is about it, right?
Well, she said that the question itself, that meaning doesn't, it's not really what it means. There can be no meaning for life because when you say a meaning of something, that's like a definition.
Right. So it's a linguistic problem, and she's looking at it from an analytic point of view, and the analytic point of view is one of the most boring philosophical positions you can get into, and happened mostly in England and the United States, and so it's a specific breed of philosophy, basically. So it's I would say basically a response to a discovery that everything we think about is framed in the context of our language. So English frames things a different way slightly than, say, Chinese, maybe drastically differently. It's kind of, I don't speak, anybody speak Chinese is one example. I picked Chinese because from what I understand, never studied Chinese, read some books about it, but basically Chinese is kind of a pictorial language. Does that make sense? That the characters are pictographs, right? So they're not, they don't, the pictures, you know what the words are supposed to sound like, I suppose, when you see the pictures if you have them memorized, but they're not phonetic. So like in Western European and Greek languages. So like in Greek, that's the letter theta or thereabouts, right? And if you think about theta, the O is your mouth, and the tongue going across to make the sound is what it's depicting, right? And you know, if I say M, or probably a rough estimate of the way your lips have to form for you to say right? O, you know, pretty obvious, right? O, you know, etc. Right? How do you get S? Well, that's not really sigma, is it? Well, sigma is one of the, right? So you get all kinds of interesting arguments over how the phonetic alphabet begins and enables people that use phonetic alphabets to do things that pictographic symbols don't enable you to do. So if I have a picture of a pig, how do you draw the pig? Does the pig have a smile? I don't think so. In Chinese? Maybe it's something like this. I don't know. However you draw a pig in Chinese. So, I mean, there's all kinds of great things about pictographs, you know, because Manchurians might not sound at all like Cantonese, but you can understand their writing traditionally because the symbols are the same even though they're pronounced completely differently. So they could have a coherent civilization for thousands of years because the writing enabled them to communicate even though if they met face to face they wouldn't understand one another. Does that make sense? But when you're using a phonetic alphabet, you can have abstract nouns like love. You know, so if you're depicting love in Chinese, I guess that's like humanity or something, but it could also be love. But it's basically a symbolic man with legs and arms, right? But when you have an alphabet, and you can have a phonetic, we know how to pronounce that love. It was one of the neat things about Russian, as I learned the phonetics of Russian. I could read Russian like crazy without knowing what the heck I was reading, you know, and it sounded really good, but I didn't know what it was, right? But you could say it right because you could, you know, there's only one way to pronounce it. Of course, English, I think we talked about this last time, English is not a real language, so we've got roots from all different languages, so you have to memorize everything in context. So it's not really a phonetic language. But the advantage to having a phonetic language is that you can now express abstract concepts that are not something you can picture an object. You could have really difficult abstract things and have a symbolic system that you could use to express it, right? How did I get into that?
You started with
Susan Wolf.
yeah.
Meaning of life. Okay, so the analytic philosophy. Analytic philosophy is focused on how language makes meaning, and what we realize is that you're structuring the way you perceive the world through the context of your language. And Chinese is so radically different, not only because of the type of the symbolic system that they use, but because those symbolic systems are so radically different. We have abstract things that we can use in English that they don't. For example, the verb to be, where we use the connector is. So if I say, all horses are animals, that's true, right? Everybody agrees? All horses are animals, right? Well, apparently you can't say that in Chinese. You can say horses, animals. You have a picture of horses, and you have a picture of animals. But you can't say horses are animals, because they don't have the R part. right? So, and there are only 4 kinds of statements that we can make that are true or false, and all of them require the verb to be. That's the traditional square of opposition. So in English and European languages, when you make a statement that can be true or false, or is true or false, it has to be one of these 4 types of statements where you're relating 2 sets of things. So this is a chair. Agrees. I said that this particular object, which is the subject, and I'm talking about all of the members of this particular thing, right? So every one of these is in the set of things that's a chair, right? And, oh, yeah, it is, right? You can see that. So voila, we can make true statements. But is it possible to make true statements in a language that doesn't have the verb to be? Well, they can't answer that, apparently. But they actually write books about it, and one of the latest books on Chinese and whether or not it can tell, has true or false statements. No, not really. But what they can do is say some statements are more pragmatic or more useful than others. You see how that would work, right? So now, what does that mean for diplomacy, by the way? If we want to say, okay, you're going to make sure that Kim doesn't nuke us. They can't say yes or no. Right? Strictly speaking, they can't make a true or false statement because Chinese doesn't have them. Does that make sense? I'm not going to go any further into that, but suffice it to say that apparently seeing the world through the eyes of a Chinese speaker is significantly different than seeing it through the eyes of, say, an English speaker. And that's why we think of, like in higher education, we say go Greek. We think of our culture as essentially a Greek kind of culture because the Greeks thought this stuff up. And so, and we can trace English and German and the Romance languages, etc., back to, and the Slavic languages too, right? Back to Greek, basically. So in a sense, there's that Greek connection. So the Greek way of thinking, this square of opposition is true for all of those languages. So once this kind of discovery came about, roughly in between World War I and World War II, England, all the philosophers in England just said, well, so the whole point of doing philosophy has to be trying to understand what we're talking about. So all these questions that the philosophers have asked since Socrates, etc., could be meaningless, right? Because you've got to figure out what the question actually means in a very, very clear sense. So we have to analyze the language. So the analytic philosophers basically focused on analyzing theory of meaning. And by the way, that's also where we created languages, new languages. Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead trying to figure out a perfect language that you could use, a symbolic language that would clear away the ambiguity in everyday speech. And by the way, that eventually became computer languages. So computers typically don't, get a app from another computer. I don't know, you download an app from your, in your phone, and your phone doesn't communicate back to that mainframe wherever you got the computer. Do we even call it that? I don't know what we call that, right? I was in the NSA, so I had the computers down in the basement. Yeah, so I'm sitting in a terminal, right? You have to wait for it to enter into the terminal, and back. So I still think in terms of echo. But so your computer, you go load an app, and your phone doesn't. Wait a minute. What do you mean by that, computer? Because they don't have any questions, right? Your computer doesn't think, I don't really understand what you mean by that. Computers don't have any, there's no ambiguity, right? So computer languages, it really works for computers. But when we have people screw it up, so we still don't get, what do you mean? If every X is, we get confused in logic. So that's kind of fun. And by the way, you can turn, so every SSP, if you want to change it into a computer language, you could go down and change it to this. So see, this could still be ambiguous, but this is not. Is that right? So that's why computer languages are supposed to be so clear. So that was all part of the analytic tradition, trying to create a language that had no ambiguity. Didn't work. They actually still have a lot of people working on this because it's actually still beneficial. Clarification does really help. But so Susan Wolf is coming from that tradition, and she's saying, hey, what do you mean the meaning of life? There's no such thing. That's a really ambiguous question. The question doesn't make sense. Ambiguous. So what's the meaning of life? But we can have the meaning of lives. But what does she mean by that? So what is it to seek meaning in life? Well, so I'm giving you kind of like the traditional list here, right? These are, you can still parse these out to the kinds of, do you want to live in the bush? Do you want to get married? Do you want to get married and have social commitments? Do you just want to get away from everything? Well, but not be, so the interesting thing about a skeptic is they're just not going to be philosophically interested, but they'll actually live a life, whatever it is. Right? I suppose that's the male that decides to just marry a smart woman and do what she says. That probably works pretty well too. Right? But so, what kinds of lives can be meaningful? And then she gives us some lives that are really like not meaningful at all. So the blob. So there's a blob. He's basically the guy that sits and watches TV all day and drinks beer and eats chips. Although she didn't mention the chips. So that's the blob. So that person's not leading a meaningful life, she says, right? Although she confesses not that there's anything wrong with TV or beer. She doesn't want to get Budweiser upset with her. Then she comes up with the useless person, right? That's another one. I don't know who she's thinking of there, but there are useless people. I thought I had these, right? They're not being very meaningful. And then the other one is the bankrupt, right? So they have a goal, but they fail in accomplishing the goal. So if the meaning of your life is accomplishing a particular goal, but you end up not succeeding in that, well, strictly speaking, you have failed to have a meaningful life because what you intended to do didn't happen, right? So if like the meaning in your life is getting a bachelor's degree and you go to college for 20 years and you still don't have one, that's kind of mean and rotten, because to me it still gives you life meaning because you still have that goal and you're still aiming at it. So I don't know. But she's being mean and rotten there. So,
Well, at the same time, she was saying that who are you to say what a meaningful life is, because that person who, the blob, was perfectly happy sitting in their chair watching TV, drinking beer every day. So who are you to say that they don't find their lives meaningful?
well, another aspect to this, though, is, and she says that there are a lot of people who don't even ask the question and who basically are in situations where they're incapable of asking that question. By the way, that ties into Thomas Nagel and his article, what does it mean to be a bat? What is it like to be a bat? And what he's talking about. By the way, Thomas Nagel was one of Susan Wolf's professors. So he was her mentor. So there's an interesting connection there, right? But so basically a bat is a mammal, the same as we are, has apparently a lot of characteristics, the same kind of needs oxygen, needs food, lives in families, hangs by its feet upside down all day, like a lot of us. Maybe not. Well, it depends. If you're living in Australia, like they're all upside down. Right? The blood rush to their head. That's really dumb. Sorry about that. Do the toilets really go the other way? I've always wondered about that. No? You don't know, or?
It's more to do with the dynamics of how a toilet is constructed.
I would think so. Yeah. That's what I've heard. It's not really because the Earth is rotating. But the winds go the other way, apparently. So if you look at the map of the winds on the top of the Earth, they go one way, but on the other, they go.
I saw an experiment on YouTube where a guy took away all the fluid dynamics, and he made it so his plug pulled out the bottom, and then he did the experiment simultaneously with the guy in the other hemisphere, and they actually did turn the other way.
But we don't make toilets
The
that
one
way.
at the equator. They did one like that at the equator,
And it just went straight.
and they did it on one
Where
side
the
of
shit
it.
flew right out of the toilet.
No, he had like a tub. You trained it into a bucket.
Sorry. Shit, it's like sex. You say the word and everybody perks up. They're very interested all of a sudden, But if you're teaching high school, don't use those words very often. Because, well, so she feels that there are a lot of people that don't even have the question. And that it's not just going to be bats. We can't conceive of bats being worried about the meaning of life, just
And
hanging around in the cave.
meaningful can mean different things to other people.
Right.
One person can feel like getting a degree is meaningful, and another person can feel like raising a family is more meaningful. Different.
Of course, you could try doing all of those at once, which is why a lot of people go crazy. They're trying to do all that at once. But with regard to other people, she does imply that there are a lot of people that can't even get involved in the question. And when I think about let's see, so I want, which one do I want? Oh, I know what I do. I go to this. So Susan Wolf, Meaning of Lives.
We have the wonderful opportunity to kick off the semester by hearing from Professor Susan Wolf herself. She will be followed by... Not only do I love what I do is valued independent of my loving to do it. Now, as I read the book, I kept thinking of William James, one of my favorite American poets. James published an essay in 1895 entitled, "Is Life Worth Living?" It was an address at Harvard's YMCA. Sorry. This question, is life worth living, was a profoundly personal one for James, because James himself struggled with keeping his hands around the reins of life. He grappled with what he called the base note of life. And in the end, he insisted that we must believe that life is worth living, and that very belief, he maintained, helps create the fact. And religion has a special place in orienting us, or those of us open to its power, to that task. Right? So I like to explain this when I teach James's essays. When I was little, my brother, I grew up on the coast of Mississippi, a small town called Moss Point. Don't laugh at me. It's named after the moss on magnolia trees. Right? And my brother used to leave me to go play baseball across the street. But in order to get there, you had to jump over a ditch. So he knew I couldn't make it. Right? And I always wanted to go, but I didn't believe that I could jump the ditch. But one day, I just simply asserted the fact that I can. And the fact that I believed that I could jump the ditch brought the fact that I actually jumped the ditch into existence. You get the point? Sure. Or if not, we'll talk about it when you take my class. Right? So religion for James in this essay is really crucial. Now, Professor Wolf doesn't limit her discussion to the dark issues of speculative melancholy, but she does make clear that meaning is specially connected to reasons to live. As she writes, quote, "There are the reasons and motives that engage us in the activities that make our lives worth living." They give us a reason to go on. And if you check out page 28, 29 in the text, she makes a Jamesian like move. I was waiting to find the footnotes, but it wasn't there. Now, what I find fascinating about this momentary convergence between James and our reading today is that James was wholly preoccupied with the question of religion. He sought to hold off a quick and easy dismissal by science of religious resources for meaning, and to insist that religion, rightly understood, affords us a way of seeing and being in the world that materialist accounts simply miss. But religion, here's my first point, at least on my read, is wholly absent from Professor Wolf's. There's a brief mention of the theologian along with the therapist on page 7. The theologian returns again on page 12 with therapist again and motivational speakers to encourage us to find our passions. The religious view shows up in a sentence on page 59 only to immediately confront Nietzsche. And there is her use of the word secular on page 62, which is doing some work, but I'm not quite sure what it is. So how are we to think about religion in the context of Professor Wolf's account about meaningfulness, with its demand for subjective attractions and objective attractiveness? How might we think of syphilis, Lord have mercy. Woo! It's the juice fast, right? How are we to think about Sisyphus' fulfillment? How might we think of Sisyphus fulfilled, for example, if we read the substance in his veins, not as inducing delusions or the lowering of his intelligence, but as the spirit of the gods, drunk with the wine of the Holy Spirit, to which he has now submitted, and that the rolling of the stone amounts to an ascetic practice.
So this is Sisyphus. Are you familiar with him? he's not explaining it because he's assuming his audience has read her book, which our article is just an excerpt from, right? But Sisyphus is, this story of the guy that rolls the boulder up the hill each day, and then it rolls back down, and then he just rolls it back up. And in other words, life is just a constant redo, right? So in other words, well, there's absolutely no meaning to this, right? But what he points out here is, from a religious perspective, if Sisyphus is doing this in adoration of a deity or something, then it actually has meaning for him, right? So.
An act of worship and devotion. To read his life as we might do of the fulfilled pot smoker as missing something, especially if the pot smoker is a Rastafarian or a practitioner of peyote, right? Suggests that perhaps something is missing in our judgment.
Or the beer drinker
So
might have
giving attention
been
to
worshiping
religion,
Dionysius.
I think I want to. In some ways, I'm trying to trouble the way in which you transition to fitting fulfillment and the way in which you think about objective attractiveness. And I think in giving attention to religion might also change how we understand sacrifice, and the way sacrifice serves as a way of hardening of making the case of the distinction between meaningfulness and I'm going to come back to that. I only have a couple of more minutes. So here I'm only trying to understand more fully how the idea of objective attractiveness works in this instance. Some may conclude that the ascetic cannot live a meaningful life, and I want to know the reasons why. I was also struck, just as an aside, by your characterization of life in pursuit of ease, prestige, material wealth, and superficial goals. Really? Why? Can we give me an account of why? Because I want to unpack some background agreements that I think aren't being made explicit, some background commitments that aren't being made explicit. So, I anticipated my transition. Part of what I'm interested in are the background agreements that inform how we assess whether something is worthy of love or not. I know you've answered this. I actually read it. I just want to hear a bit more. Now, second concern. Second concern involves a footnote in the second lecture. Now, you are all just heard Professor Dolvin talking about read the footnotes. All right? Not the footnote that gave us the wonderful chocolate mousse with cinnamon cream recipe, but you write in a footnote, quote, many people,
Here it is.
through no fault of their own, simply lack the opportunity for meaning. Their physical, economic, or political circumstances deprive them of the freedom or the leisure to explore and pursue activities they would love. Many people, through no fault of their own, simply lack the opportunity for meaning. Now, this is a footnote to a sentence that you are making a distinction where people can live lives without contemplating the idea of meaning, but still leave meaningful lives. But here we're not talking about the idea of meaning, we're talking about people who lack the opportunity for meaning. Now, I found this claim really interesting. In the body of the text, you emphasize that some people can live meaningful lives without giving the idea of meaning a moment of explicit thought. I can imagine people who are toiling day in and day out, not giving the idea any consideration. But here you're suggesting that folks lack the opportunity for meaning. So obviously I would love for you to say a little bit more about this. It could be the case that the very life that you have described as meaningful requires lives that lack an opportunity. And here I'm thinking of the language of bourgeois American values, which you wring your hands over a lot in the text. I may just be bourgeois, right? Or put another way, it seems that the meaningfulness of life and the reasons of love that motivate us to pursue it require some account of the conditions that make such a life possible. If some among us live lives that lack the opportunity for meaning, and that lack of opportunity is the direct result of the space afforded to others to actively pursue meaningful lives, then it seems to me that we have to give some attention to the kinds of conditions requisite for all of us to pursue meaningful lives, apart from those of us with temperaments that make it difficult for us to
So, apart from bats, which we don't conceive of as worrying about the meaning of their lives, there are people that apparently are in the same boat. And so the problem that she brings up and that he emphasizes here is what does that mean? You know, what in what sense are there a lot of people that don't even have the opportunity to think about having a meaningful life, right? What does that suggest to you? Do you have any comments on this? Do you know anybody that's not leading a meaningful life and could care less? They don't even think about it?
Maybe they don't have the option to pursue it.
Well, what do you need? What's he talking about when he says there are things that you need in order to be able to pursue it?
Like, not just the situation, but also your perspective on it. You have to have the desire and the will to actually go do something other than just sit there and cash eat Doritos.
I didn't say Doritos, but I
like
have to admit, those are the chips I buy.
Maybe like Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Absolutely, absolutely, that plays a role. Everyone familiar with Maslow's hierarchy? Yes, maybe? No? This is actually Aristotle too. When you go back, Aristotle talks about, and Plato gives us classes. For Plato, it's obvious that there are differences between the psychologies of people, mostly maybe defined by class for Plato. So there are people that are only interested in physical things. There are another class of people that are primarily motivated because of spiritual rewards. So he's thinking in terms of the militia, love, friendship, honor, those kinds of rewards, right? And then there's the wise who are primarily motivated by learning for the sake of knowledge alone, right? That's Plato. And it's absolutely clear in Plato and Aristotle's Athens at the time that there were very few individuals who had the time and the money to basically sit around and talk to people like Socrates and think about love and beauty and the literature and music and things of that sort. So when we think of the pyramid, right, or the triangle, right, you're thinking that the folks up here are the 1%. 5%. Everyone else is down here just trying to figure out, how do we eat today? Are we going to get food? Do we have shelter? Imagine all the people in the islands right now down in the Caribbean are in bad shape. Basically standing in line on the beach just like the military in Dunkirk. You saw the movie. So they're worried about all these. They're probably not standing there in line saying, what's the meaning of life?
Just because you don't get to the top tier in that example, I don't think necessarily means you haven't lived a meaningful life. Like, to some people, just meeting the bottom, needs there and accomplishing that for their family, maybe that is a meaningful life for them because they didn't have the opportunity previously, or they grew up without that. So having the opportunity just to provide a home, or maybe like owning a home, and if I feel like falls in there, that is like creating a meaningful life for their kids. So I feel like at any tier on that, as long as your perspective is that you're having a meaningful life, there's not a reason that you wouldn't have that opportunity.
Well, what about mental capacity, though? I had the wonderful opportunity to adopt a child who was 13 months old. It was our third child. And I have to admit, when we talked to the social worker, we said, we're open to special needs as long as their mind is okay. And so they said, and they promised us that his mind was okay. And they lied. Well, probably they didn't lie, they just didn't know, maybe. But so what we ended up with was a child who had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which we didn't really find out very clearly about until really he was already 18, 19, older than that. That's my son Christopher, and I'm absolutely convinced Christopher cannot lie, nor can he tell the truth, because he doesn't make that connection between this is the case or this is not the case. His answers to people are usually framed in response to the way they frame the question. So I've even done this like in a situation where people would ask him the same question, but put it in a positive or negative context. So for example, they said, so you don't have any trouble with moving and changing around, changing, etc. And put it into a positive way of answering. And his answer was, oh no, I don't have any trouble with that. But if you put it into a negative sense, so you have trouble with, moving and stuff of that sort. Oh yeah, in the same half-hour conversation. So he doesn't realize he's contradicting what he just said, right? So I've seen one social worker said he's like a chameleon. He becomes like what's going on around him. Can't tell jokes. And when he laughs, he sees everybody else laughing, he'll laugh, but it's pretty clear he's not understanding what's so funny. And when he tries to tell a joke occasionally, and then he laughs at the point where he thinks he told the punchline, and we're all wondering, that's not a joke, right? So there's like a logic circuit that you can see it's not connecting in his mind. He can't tell time. Now you could use a digital watch where he just sees it's 10:26, but if he sees a analog, he can't tell what time it is because it doesn't make sense to him, even though he's 30. How old is he? 34 now, right? So he can't deal with money. And he got his paycheck from working on the fish processing plant for like 3 months. Came back and he bought drinks for everybody in the bar. All of it in 1 hour session, right? No thinking, but then he has trouble paying rent, right? So I don't think he has a sense. I mean, he does get bored. He always wants excitement of some kind or another. He wants the excitement that's going on around him. But does he have a sense of meaning in life? I don't think so. I mean, I'm making a judgment here that it's like me trying to figure out, does a bat have a meaningful life? I can't really communicate with the bat. But I'm not sure in what sense I can really communicate with Christopher either. I mean, I love Christopher, but boy, Christopher has been in jail, right? All the problems that you could find yourself in. So he's always down in this area here. There's something missing in the way he conceives of the world, I think, because of those logic circuits that are missing in his brain that we can't fix. It's not a matter of training with manipulatives or any kind of, it's like you're trying to load a program on a computer that doesn't have the right hardware. I don't think he can be ethical. And a social worker put her wallet on the table and said, if I got up and left the room, would you take that? I said, well, yeah.
At least he's honest.
get the problem, right? You know that, wait a minute, whoa, that's a shock. By the way, Chris thought when he graduated from high school, all of his mental problems would go away. But he just had to graduate, he's done. He won't be a special needs person anymore. With that, how did he conceive of that? And by the way, that's not just Christopher. There's, I believe, roughly 25% of the population of Alaska is in the same boat as Christopher. Does that sound about right?
Wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, some folks would tell me that, no, that's the prison population. Yes. Exactly. You have to be mentally ill to break the law. I think that's the definition of mental illness, practically, for me. I know that's not, the official definition is no, because it's the one psychologist at the Matsu prison said, no, we can't do that, because of course that means we have to spend more money to treat them. So, you know, you can't define it in a way that makes it too expensive for us to deal with, right? Is that, sorry. It was a real conversation I had with a person in the prison. What?
There's that going against the power again.
Well, let's not define them as needing our help if that means we're going to have to help them because we don't have the money to help them. That's terrible. So, that seems like, what else do you need in order to have a meaningful life? The way Susan Wolf is talking. Should we take a break? I think it's, is that clock right? Not quite.
7-Eleven.
Oh, thank heavens.
Slushy time.
Pardon?
Slushy time.
Slushy time. Let's take a break. We're about 10 minutes. Do you have any questions so far? Is this fun? Are you having a good time? Good time is had by all. Getting your money's worth.